Hi, this conversation is bringing me joy, so I am very glad to be here with you all. So I am hopeful that we can pull up on the screen our brief overview, wonderful, of the bill. So I think as many of you know, this the panic defense has been a legal strategy that's been used across the country, and it really ends up putting the blame on the victim of the person who has experienced the violence. So it allows perpetrators of violence to actually blame the person that they perpetrated violence against for their sexual orientation or for their gender identity, which is just wrong in so many levels. We know that LGBTQ people experience really high rates of violence and of murder. And so the fact that someone who has committed an act of violence could actually be excused for that act by blaming the victim is just abhorrent. And so we were really glad to work hand in hand with Delegate Danica Roem's office and with the National LGBT Law Center and with the Action Alliance and Project Horizon and lots of folks across the Commonwealth who really stood up and advocated against the so-called defense, because we know that it is so wrong in so many ways. The victim should never be blamed for an act of violence. And so there has been this nationwide effort, and I'm sure Wes, who you'll hear more from, is on the panel. You'll hear that national perspective that this has been attempted to be addressed in many states across the country. And as you can see on this map, we have actually introduced similar legislation in quite a few states. And that's indicated by the orange. The blue states are states where legislation banning the panic defense has actually been passed. We're really glad that Virginia is the 12th state and the 13th place. DC has also banned the panic defense as well. And so we're really glad to be the first Southern state and among the first really in the country to ban this defense. We know that LGBTQ people, especially Black and brown trans women, experience the highest rates of violence in our community. And so this, in so many ways, sends a signal to the world, to Virginia, that violence against the community is never okay. It is never excusable. And so we think that it helps create an added layer, an added sense of safety to people's lives, their day-to-day lives. And so that is a little bit of background there. I am just going to go ahead and pass it back over to our panel, who are really going to, again, provide us with some additional information about how the bill came about, some of those advocacy efforts, what this effort has looked like nationwide, and then what this really means here in Virginia. How are we ensuring that Virginians, that people in the judicial system and the criminal justice system are aware of this change and make sure that this impact is really truly felt across the Commonwealth. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Talia, who's going to introduce our panelists.
Hey everyone, thank you again so much for being here with us today. As I mentioned earlier, we ask that you stay muted during the panel portion of the program. But as your questions come up, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. We are tracking them, as I mentioned, and we will do our best to answer as many of those as possible. And just to get us started, we'll have some pre-prepared questions. But before we get into any of that, I of course want all of our panelists to introduce themselves. And so we will go ahead and start off with Delegate Danica Roem, if that's okay.
Sure, thank you so much, Talia. It's great to see everyone. My name is Danica Roem. I represent the 13th district of the Virginia House of Delegates, which includes the city of Manassas Park and the Prince William County portions of Haymarket, Gainesville, and my lifelong home, Manassas.
Wonderful. Thank you again for joining us. Adam, would you like to go next?
Sure. My name is Adam Schultz. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the spiritual counselor at Project Horizon, which is a domestic and sexual violence shelter here in Lexington, Virginia. We serve Lexington, Buena Vista, and all of Rockbridge County, which makes me a community-based advocate. And I'm also the pastor here at Good Shepherd Lutheran Church here in Lexington. And I also identify as gay.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing all that background. Sarah, would you like to go next?
Yes, my name is Sara Simone. I'm a case manager with Friendship Place. We're a contractor with the Veterans Administration, so I work primarily with homeless veterans, and I've been in social services about 20 years, well over 20 years at this point. Also a member of the Trans Speakers Bureau at ED.
We're so glad to have you with us. Thanks for joining. Wes, would you like to go next?
Hi, I'm Wes Bizzell. I use he, him pronouns. I am a president of the National LGBTQ Plus Bar Association and an in-house counsel with Altria as well.
Wes. Tara, would you like to hit us off next?
Sure, I'm Tara Casey. I'm on the faculty of the University of Richmond School of Law, and I'm also the director of the Carrico Center for Pro Bono and Public Service that is at the law school.
And last but certainly not least, Ruth, would you like to kick it off?
Sure, thank you. Hi, I'm Ruth Micklem, and I'm with the Virginia Sexual and Domestic Violence Action Alliance, and we are a statewide coalition of folks who work on behalf of victims of intimate partner and sexual violence. And we supported this bill, and I'm really happy to be here and talk about why.
Wonderful. Thank you, y'all. What an amazing group of panelists we have today. I'm really excited to go ahead and get us started. So the first question that we're going to ask today is a little bit legalistic. So not everyone has to answer it if they would not like to, but I want to ground us and give us some really good background that we can build off of. So the first question is, what is the LGBTQ panic defense? And can you expand on the history of the panic defense in Virginia? Anyone is welcome to start.
Well, I'm happy to give a brief overview. So the panic defense is a not a freestanding legal defense, but it is used to what we call mitigate the crime. So reduce either the sentence or the charge of murder or violence, assault. And it happens in one of three ways. It happens where the assailant, the murderer, says that they were acting in self-defense, that it was usually in this case as a result of a pass made to them, and so they were defending themselves in assaulting or murdering the LGBTQ plus victim. It also happens in what we call crime of passion or provocation defenses, and so that's where the claim is that the sudden revelation or realization of the victim's LGBTQ plus status made the person react, and so they panicked, if you will, and murdered or assaulted the victim. And less likely that you see nowadays is sort of an insanity or diminished capacity defense, where the murderer claims that they engaged in the conduct as a result of a temporary insanity based on the knowledge of the victim's LGBTQ plus status. That happened, if some of you may remember, in the Jenny Jones case of about 20 years ago. But we certainly have seen these throughout the country as well. And back in 2013, the National LGBTQ Bar Association convinced the American Bar Association's House of Delegates, which is their legislative body, to pass a resolution calling for a ban on the defense. That passed unanimously, I'm happy to report. And since then, we've been working across the country to get states to adopt it. California was the first. And we are so happy that we've added Virginia to the list this year, as well as other states.
And if I just wanted to add, like where these defenses usually happen is, for the burden of proof being shifted is, ultimately always the burden of proof is on the prosecution to prove the elements of the crime. But then when we talk about affirmative defenses or defenses is that the burden can then shift if there's an affirmative defense of, as was shared of provocation, reason of insanity, or self-defense, that there is then a recognized list of criteria that if a defendant is able to show these elements, then they have raised then a bar, a defense of, self-defense that excuses or mitigates or lessens the charge or the sentence that is at play. And then the burden shifts back to the prosecution to then have to say that that defense is not viable. It's not, it's just a pretext. And so before you had panic defense bans on the books, you would see this shift happen in the courtroom as to whether, first of all, a judge would allow the defense to stand to begin with, to be alleged, and then whether the prosecution was able to overcome the presentation of that defense. And then oftentimes then you're talking about having to convince a jury who may possess their own biases that this is whether or not this is a worthy of defense. And so you're having to see the shifting burden occur in the courtroom while also recognizing that there are biases in that space as well. So unless there's a ban on the books regarding this defense, it really is left to a court by court scenario, which then could just lead to inconsistency just across the country.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, sounds like it's really kind of putting the victim on trial in some ways, which is just unacceptable. I'd also like to hear from Delegate Roem about some of the history in Virginia in terms of how this got introduced legislatively, motivations, things like that.
Sure. So the reason I introduced this bill was because I had a 15-year-old out student constituent from Manassas Park High School who asked me to, because, in 2020, when he sent me that email over the summer, I came to realize very quickly that he was living with the same fear in 2020 that I had in October 1998 when I was a 14-year-old high school freshman when Matthew Shepard was killed, and the same fear that I had when I was 18 as a college freshman when Gwen Rahu was killed that October. And so for me, this, on the one hand, it's entirely relatable. Like, I understand what it means to live in that fear. Number two, we have actual case precedent here in Virginia of this being used over and over and over and over again. In committee alone, we presented 9 different cases where it was used, 8 that we documented, and then there was just a reference of a 9th. That is strictly what one of our advocates, Karsten Anderson, was able to actually produce in the very short amount of time before we went into committee. That is not an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination. And keep in mind, whenever a LGBTQ panic defense is used in court, it's not like that suddenly shows up in LexisNexis under, haha, I incited the gay panic defense today. And then you do your control find and you can find it. You have to really know what you're looking for. And the way that it will come up will vary case to case to case. So the fact that we have a researcher who is even able to put together those 9 cases just in the very short amount of time that he actually had on this, that says that, number one, there's probably a whole hell of a lot more times where it's been used. But number two, these are 9 cases where it's particularly egregious, where we're talking about murder charges and severe assault charges being knocked down, and basically having years cut off of sentences, for example. And the fact that one of the most frustrating things with this is time and time again. And here's the thing, as someone who spent 12 years fronting heavy metal bands, I like to think I'm pretty damn loud when I want to be. And I like to think that especially as a Sicilian Italian woman who is a good extrovert, I really know how to project my voice. So I find it really fascinating when I say the same damn thing 3 times, 4 times, 6 times in committee, and then it's like it goes in one ear and out the other ear of a committee members, of some of the committee members, and then they go onto the Senate floor and they're like, oh my God, has this even ever been used in Virginia? Yes, we presented all of that evidence. We showed you already. You have to care enough to actually pay attention to what it is that we're putting in front of you. So that's the legislative history that came with this. Virginia, of the 12 states that got this, that's now gotten this on. And by the way, since Virginia passed this back in March, we have seen Vermont, Maryland, and Oregon now passed theirs. The Vermont one has already been signed into law. Maryland should be signed into law in the next 10 days. And obviously the one in Oregon will be signed into law because, well, Kate Brown is amazing. So not to mention she's family. So with all that, what do all these other states have in common that Virginia doesn't? Every other state that dealt with this legislatively, it was a nearly unanimous vote. It was like, maybe one person, maybe two people here or there, or just, like in Vermont, just completely unanimous, right? And in Maryland, it was unanimous, just they've done well with that. Virginia turned into a partisan bleep show. And it makes me so upset that that actually happens, where out of 45 House Republicans, they gave us 4 votes. Out of 18 state Senate Republicans at the time, they gave us 3 votes. Why? Why is it that not allowing people to get away with murdering and assaulting your constituents isn't a completely bipartisan affair? How is it possible that you can look at someone who hurts and kills your constituents and you go, you know what, sometimes that's okay, sure. We're not talking about LGBTQ people physically attacking anyone. We're not talking about a need for self-defense in this case. This is more like in November of 2013, I was in Henrico. I was just out with a couple of my girlfriends out for a night, and we were at basically what I would refer to as a straight bar. And, I never felt comfortable, per se going, but at the same time, it was like 2 weeks before I started HRT. I wanted to start venturing out, dressed as myself. And as we went out, there was this one guy who was like, more or less sitting on myself and my friend Jacqueline. So he came back to a table with us. Next thing I know, getting a little flirty. Next thing I know, after that, my tongue is in the mouth, whatever. Everything's going well for me, right? I'm 29 and single. I feel great. Well, his friend who's sitting across is getting increasingly more agitated, visually agitated, to the point where I tell the guy, I was just like, it seems like your friend really wants you to go right now. And he's like, well, that's the problem because it's my truck and these are my keys. And so it was like, he wasn't going to go. Well, the guy starts getting really antsy now. Now he's starting to, make the body motion stuff. So my friends come up, they literally get me by the elbows and go, all right, we have to go now. All right, see you, bye. And we get out the door. What was happening in that moment was this guy's realization that I was not a cisgender woman, that I was a trans woman, and that his partner, who he's with that night, or just his buddy, happened to, be physically attracted to a trans woman. It was driving him absolutely mad. And it was getting to the point where he was getting ready to attack me. Had that actually happened, this is the exact sort of case where he could have absolutely brought this up in court in order to try to, basically, get a lesser sentence or, to reduce his charge. And where I fall on this at the end of the day on this is when your bigotry is playing on the bias of a judge and the bias of a jury to say that, well, what would you have done in this situation? Wouldn't you have done this? When I was asked, well, hey, Danica, how come we don't have this based on other protected classes in Virginia under the Human Rights Act? Like, how come we don't do this based on skin color? How come we don't do this based on disability? How come we don't do this X, Y, and Z, right? In most cases in Virginia and just across the country, if you are now in the modern day at a point of saying, I attacked this person in a moment of panic because of their color, there's a 0% chance that is going to actually reduce a charge. We have way too much case law to say that it does not. If you say, however, that it was done based on sexual orientation or gender identity, what then happens is you have someone go, yeah, I can see that. Maybe that doesn't happen throughout, our urban crescent all the time. Maybe we're going to think of ourselves as, so progressive, and everything now in modern Virginia where we can't possibly think of that happening. It happened in Norfolk in 2011. It happens all across the state. And this is one of those things where I have to emphasize on this, that yes, we do have parts of Virginia that are very rural, very conservative places where trans people and, LGBT people in general are going to not have an easy way going through the criminal justice system. At the same time, do not think for a moment that Virginia is this progression beacon of pro-trans morality at this point, where we can just, live our lives without having any fear or any repercussions for our mere existence. We get attacked, we get hurt, and we have to have our ways where the justice system says, no, you cannot single out someone to hurt them simply for existing. And that's what we're doing here. And then the last thing I just want to mention on this, sorry for my little soliloquy, I'm just super amped up right now. As we are seeing what's happening in all these other states, where Tennessee is just being outright horrible right next door to us right now. They're going after trans kids' medical care. They're going after their ability to even be present in a restroom, where the school system can be sued for a trans kid just washing their hands in the sink, not talking to another person, where they are just trying to be absolutely awful. And 3 times this week, they've signed anti-trans bills in law. And you saw what happened in Arkansas. You've seen what's happened in all these other states. When we've passed more than 24 pro-LGBTQ equality bills in the last 2 years, and this bill this year in particular, we are telling LGBTQ Americans, wherever you are in the country, that you are welcome, celebrated, respected, and protected here in Virginia because of who you are, not despite it, and not for what discriminatory politicians tell you you're supposed to be. So while there is very, very much the practical policy aspect of this, in that a judge will have to instruct a jury to disregard any claim of that defense if it were to be invoked in court. The other thing that it does is it sends a message across the country that Virginia welcomes its LGBTQ constituents. And even if all the public won't, even if you're gonna have problems here or there, at least your state government does, and we got your back.
I'd like to pick up on a little bit something that Delegate Roem said. These are particularly brutal crimes when they occur and when this is raised. We've seen cases where the panic defense was used, the victim was stabbed and slashed, more than 6 times. You've seen another where the victim was, choked with a wallet chain, drowned, then his body was doused in gasoline and set on fire. Delegate Roem, mentioned the case of Matthew Shepard, who was, brutally pistol whipped and tortured and tied to a fence post where he was left to die. The police said that more than 20 blows rained down on him so hard that they fractured his skull 6 times. In the case of Angie Zapata, her boyfriend beat her to death, and then with a fire extinguisher, bludgeoned her with a fire extinguisher. And then when she started, he noticed that she was still breathing. He went back to her and beat her again until he, as he told the police, killed it. And so these are horrific crimes that are occurring, and it is based on that bias that allows the defendant, the murderer, to say, well, if you were in my shoes, you would have done it too. And that is not only degrading to the victim, it's degrading to our justice system and to our entire community as well.
Thank you, everyone, for really providing a depth into what this law does, how it's been used in the past, what that looks like here in Virginia, and how that's kind of manifested, and kind of maybe some hope moving forward as well for the message that this sends. I also want to make sure that we definitely hear from our community advocates. So we have another question, or I'll offer 2 questions really, so whichever one I think feels best that y'all want to answer. What does this ban mean for LGBTQ Virginians' safety and protection? And then similarly, what do our communities need in order to be safe from violence? So I'll put those in the chat too, but if any of those are questions that you want to answer, specifically Ruth, Sara, and Adam, please feel free.
Yeah, Adam and Sara, if you're okay, I'll sort of take that big picture response, and then maybe you guys can talk about the safety in the community. So when I think about, and I really think about the question around safety and what does this mean for safety in the biggest sense, is in many ways it's part of the long-term game. So let me talk a little bit about that. So I've been doing work in the violence against women or ending sexual and domestic violence field for almost 40 years here in Virginia. And I learned early on that there are, that perpetrators of violence very often use excuses to justify their acts, and that those excuses are really bound up in or tied into biases that you all have already talked about, that people, the general public or jurors, really hook into, or judges. And that part of unraveling that really means we have to eliminate some of those excuses to really start to address some of the biases that are part of our culture. So for example, we eliminated, you couldn't use how somebody dressed or who they slept with before to excuse rape or sexual assault through rape shield laws. We eliminated the concept that it was okay to rape your wife or your spouse because you were married to them, by eliminating marital rape. And it wasn't that you essentially eliminated those violent acts from happening, but what you're able to do with that is to start to build a public consciousness and culture that those are not justifications for violence. And I think that this bill really is sort of falls along those same lines, and really essentially says that homophobia is not an excuse to commit violence against somebody. And from the perspective of our work in the domestic violence and intimate partner violence field, one of the things that we learned early on is that if we're going to eliminate intimate partner violence and sexual violence, that we have to work together to eliminate hatred and biases across the board. And that means we have to work equally as hard to address racism, classism, ableism, and homophobia, and our joining together to do that begins to really undo that culture that supports the violence and horrific violence that so many of us experience. So, that's really I think the big picture view of our support for a bill like this, and really thinking about how we in movements work together to really dismantle some of the structures that support violence in so many different ways. So it's kind of, again, one of the long-term gains around safety, that to sort of think of it as a tool in the toolbox of the many things that we have to put together in order to really address violence in the long run. So yeah, and I'll stop right there. Could say a lot about it, and I think that's enough for now.
I can talk about it from a personal perspective, but also looking at a larger perspective in states that don't have this law. And I'm just so excited about what's been going on in Virginia the last couple of years. It's been amazing. But in 2017, of course, we didn't have the law then, and I was living in Alexandria, Virginia. And since I started my transition, it's been kind of a rocky road, and I've been through homelessness, and I've been through that, that percentage of trans people that really struggle. Like I had to go through all that, losing family members, not being able to find work and all that. So I got my feet back on the ground and finally did that. And I moved into a shared housing situation in Alexandria. And I thought, Alexandria, that's cool. I mean, I'm not gonna have any trouble there. And I was living there about 2 years, and a roommate moved in, a male roommate. He identified that I was trans. And so one evening, it was my birthday, actually. I was at Freddy's, and hopefully you all know Freddy's, or celebrating my birthday. And I went back that night and I heard him talking on the phone, and he saw me come in and my window was open. He was talking really loud, and I don't want to use the language that he used, but he was using a lot of transphobic and homophobic slurs, and MFs this and MFs that. And what really shook, like, I didn't know he felt this way. I was totally oblivious. And I'm hearing this. And what really shook me was he said, well, the neighborhood wants me to do something about it. So what I was hearing was he was feeling pressure from neighbors to do, because I run a lot. Like I'm the jogger runner. So people see me, you don't wear makeup when you run. So however I looked, I guess I wasn't passable to whoever these neighbors were, but they were putting pressure on him to take care of me. And he was angry. And I felt that anger in the phone call. And when he found out I was home, he was escalating more and more. And I was never so terrified in my life. I went to the kitchen, got a knife, locked my door, barricaded myself in the house. And this is in Alexandria. I've been through something like that before when I lived in parts of DC or kind of like the hood, which was kind of rough. And Alexandria, no, it's got to be great. We're in Virginia. And literally I had to leave there because he was gonna, I don't know if he would have done something to me, if he would have used that, defense or not. But I was out of there within, this happened on a Sunday night. By Wednesday, I moved into where I'm living now, which is amazing. My neighbors here love me. So the last 3.5 years have been great. It's like, wow, oh my God, it's the best neighborhood in Virginia, I think. But that's kind of a personal perspective. And I was terrified. And I've been a victim of a lot of like kind of brutality. So, but that night was like, oh my gosh. And there are two examples. And first off, I mean, the hate crime murder of trans women last year was a record, 44. This year we're on pace to beat that. It's going to go over 50. If it keeps on this pace. And a lot of these, whenever I see that on a feed, on the LGBT feed, they look like me. Each of these women, they keep looking like me, like they're trans women of color. When I see them, I see myself, and it's very discouraging. Even with all the positive things going on in Virginia, there's so much hatred out there. And Danica mentioned also what's happening to trans kids all over a lot of these states. But there are two states. Well, New York, they just passed a law in 2019, and you wonder what took New York so long, a very liberal state, 2019. Mississippi hasn't passed a law. In Mississippi, I don't want to get too graphic. There was a young woman named Dee Wickham, and she was a nurse. She's only 25 years old. And she met a gentleman at a black rodeo. I never thought, there's a black rodeo? That sounds really cool. But, and she met this gentleman. I guess they found some attraction in each other. And he ended up murdering her that night. And he stabbed her 119 times. And he stabbed her until there was nothing left. And almost all the stab wounds were in the face and the neck. And he used a military fixed blade Gerber knife, 9 inches, or 10 inch, who brings 10-inch knife to go on a date for somebody? And he used that defense in Mississippi. And of course, there's no hate crime laws in Mississippi. But when detectives got there, they were saying that, and this is in Mississippi, that detectives were like vomiting. It was such a disgusting scene. She was basically decapitated. And he was able, his name is Dwayne Hickerson, he was able to plead to a lesser charge, not first-degree murder, after stabbing someone 119 times. And so he got a reduced sentence. And what was the most discouraging thing about the trial is Dee's own family. And she was a beloved nurse. I mean, her patients loved her. They loved her at the hospital where she worked. But her own family, this is what her sister said at sentencing. This is what she said. I didn't approve of his lifestyle. Denisha Wiggum said about her brother. So I can understand what you said happened. I can understand your anger. This is what her family said. And they were saying, we miss our son, we miss our brother, but we could understand why you got so angry. And so he was able to use that panic defense, to get some time off of a charge. And the last one is, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of her, was Elon Nettles in New York. And this is before they had the panic defense in 2013. And she was this amazing young woman. She's interested in a fashion career. She's actually doing fashion. She's going to school for fashion. And all she was doing with some of her friends was just walking down the street. And of course, these guys saw her across the street, started catcalling her. And one of the guys went over, because he identified her as trans, and he beat her to death with his bare hands. And he used the panic defense. And at the trial, this is what he testified. At the trial, James Dixon testified that he did not categorically hate LGBT people. But after learning that Nettles was a trans woman, Dixon said he felt his manhood in question. I don't care about what they do, he said of LGBT people. I just don't want to be fooled. My pride was at stake. That perceived threat of his pride prompted Dixon to throw Nettles to the ground and beat her to death. And he used the panic defense. And all she was doing was walking down the street. And he pleaded to first-degree murder, but he's only given 12 years. And with good behavior, he's not going to spend 12 years in jail from beating someone to death. So panic defense, it's a horrible thing. So so I'm so happy what Virginia is doing. And I think it lets people know that they can't use that, at least here. And there's 50 states, so there's a lot of work to do in the United States. And lastly, and I don't want to go too long, there's this radio show called The Breakfast Club. It's very popular in the urban community. It's a national radio show. And Janet Mock, who we all know and love, was a guest on the breakfast show. The first or second trans woman to be on that show, to talk to a more urban community, which needs a lot of help in understanding us. And the show went well. But the next day they had another guest on, a comedian, and the host of the show asked the comedian, well, what would you do if you were with a trans woman and she didn't tell you? And he said this on the show, I would kill her. He just said it right out there on the show. And of course the host like giggling said, you can't do that. But they were laughing while they were saying that on this national show. And that is some of the struggles, which I'm going to say, which others won't, that we have to get over in the Black community, for sure.
Thank you, Sara and Ruth, for giving that perspective. I don't have a whole lot to add to that, but I will say that as community advocates here, some of our work that will continue is to make sure that judges uphold the statute fairly, and that that a defense similar to the panic defense isn't admitted by another name, and that we at Project Horizon here are working with organizations across the Commonwealth to train Commonwealth attorneys as well as police officers about working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, so that they are trauma informed and so that they know how to properly address people who have from underserved communities like the LGBTQIA+ community, as well as people of color, as well as male survivors. These are all underserved populations from our perspective, at least. And then additionally, there's a history of animosity between the LGBTQIA+ community and law enforcement that goes long before Stonewall. and it has echoing repercussions still today. And as community advocates, our job is to try to address and overcome those barriers, so that people of the LGBTQI+ community can access justice. And if they don't feel comfortable going to a police station, we want to make sure that people of the LGBTQI+ community here in Rockbridge County know that Project Horizon is a safe place to come. And that is why we plan and sponsor the Pride Festival here in Rockbridge County. We do support groups for LGBTQI+ people. You know, it is an active part of the work that we do, so that people know that they have a safe place to go to, so that if they find themselves being survivors of domestic or sexual violence, that they know that they have a place to go to.
If I could add something to what you just shared, Reverend Schultz, is that the Virginia State Bar just recently, within the past 2 weeks, passed a resolution, the Board of Governors, that has now allowed for elimination of bias training to count for our continuing legal education. So we are required as lawyers to have 12 CLE credits every year, and they govern what constitutes as being CLE worthy. And the Board of Governors Bar Council just passed this change saying that now if it's an elimination of bias training, that can count for CLE credit, which historically it had not. So I see this also as an opportunity for community groups and professional bar associations to work together for that training, especially in the LGBTQ+ space, including both, criminal defense bar, CA association, but just in general, the bar in general, because it's from the bar where the judges come from. So the lawyers of today are going to be the judges of tomorrow. So if we're able to get into those CLE trainings, those conferences, those professional development seminars with this type of training, I think that would also go a long way to hopefully creating a more equitable space within our courtrooms.
Thank you all. I really appreciate the depth of perspective that you just shared, both with the work that you've done as community advocates working against violence in your communities, as well as sharing personal experiences and the true scope of this issue in Virginia and also just in our larger society. We only have a few more minutes left for the panel. We'll wrap up right around 12:55, but we do have one topic that we wanted to get to real quick. If folks could just give us, if you could keep it a little shorter, because we do want to try to get to as many folks as possible on this last topic. But basically regarding actually what Adam was talking about. And so we know that a lot of folks do not feel safe or are scared, have fear about going to the police to report crimes or just engaging with the court process. It's very confusing and inaccessible, and a lot of folks feel judged in that process as well. So in both of those legal spheres, there's a lot of fear that folks have. And so basically, I think we want to know, what does banning the LGBT panic defense have to do with that? And just more broadly, like, what can folks do if they're concerned about that? Like, what other options are there? Things like that. And I think it'd be great to hear from lawyers and community advocates on this issue.
Actually, I'd like to kick off this with a very simple thing that police can do with this, is to actually appoint an LGBTQ liaison into the community. We have a number of those throughout the state, but here's the thing, in Prince William County, our last police chief told me, oh yeah, we have someone, but we're not publicizing who that person was. Like, they wouldn't put it on their website or anything like that, or on their Facebook page. We need a comprehensive database that maybe it could be on Equality Virginia's website or whoever, and just all 133 localities throughout Virginia. It says that if you're an LGBTQ person and something happens to you and you need police intervention with this, here is who to call from the police department who is not going to inherently be hostile to you. That should be a very, very basic thing that we should be able to do.
I'll also say that, the getting to educate courts is tough. Judges act in their own little fiefdoms, but the National LGBTQ plus bar, I've done some trainings with the National Judicial College, but we know, similar to the interactions with police, interactions with courts, in addition to being sort of this sort of scary place for most people, aren't LGBTQ friendly either. A survey from Lambda Legal showed that 19% had heard a judge or an attorney or another employee make a negative comment about a person's sexual orientation or gender identity. When you looked at trans women, that number jumped to 66%. 66% of trans women heard comments in the court system that were transphobic or homophobic. 53% of gender nonconforming people of color, the same. And so, it is an educational component. It is, hopefully, as Tara said, as our country changes and as new lawyers come up, the things will change. But I do want to be realistic. It is a slow process, especially as it regards the court system. But it takes leadership of bar associations and people calling for change before the courts will do something.
And building upon that, I hope what I'm going to do is drop in the chat is to give you all some resources. This is a great time to reach out to lawyers and to reach out to professional associations with this type of professional development that could be available. The first is I'm going to give a plug to the Virginia Equality Bar Association. That is LGBTQ plus affinity association of attorneys throughout Virginia. And they one of the things they've done is pro bono name and gender marker change clinics, but they also do a lot of advocacy and training of lawyers and judges throughout the Commonwealth. So I encourage y'all to do that. For folks who are statewide, is to get connected to your local and specialty bar association. Here is a listing in the chat of all of the local, specialty, and statewide bar associations in Virginia. So no matter where you are in Virginia, and I'm happy to help make connections with folks if you're wanting an introduction to any of the leadership here. That would be a great place to start developing, cultivating those relationships to get in front of the judges, to get in front of the lawyers with this type of education. And then the last plug I'm going to make is for the Supreme Court of Virginia a number of years ago created the Access to Justice Commission, and I currently serve on the Access to Justice Commission, which is meant to bridge and fill that access to justice gap. One of the committees on that is the Judicial Education Committee. It is the committee that is designed to how are we training our judges? What can we get in front of our judges to, again, create a more equitable courtroom? And here I just dropped in the chat a link to some of the resources that committee has already put out through the commission. But they are always looking to hear from the community as to where they're seeing more needs that need to be met. So again, I put all of the links in the chat. I'm happy to make connections. I guess I should tell you how to get in touch with me in the chat as well. Here I am. You can Google me. I don't, feel free to Google, but I'm happy to help make any of those connections as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add that as far as accessing some support and assistance, I put in the chat the statewide LGBTQ helpline that's operated by our statewide sexual and domestic violence hotline. And so there's a text and a chat number in there. Actually, I don't know that I got the chat number, but I'll get that in there. So I'd encourage folks to use that. And then I just want to really encourage our thinking around, I want to quote an old friend and mentor, Suzanne Farr, who wrote in 1988 in her book, Homophobia, A Weapon of Sexism, that to eliminate one oppression successfully, a movement has to include work to eliminate them all, or else success will only be limited and incomplete. And as somebody who's been working to train law enforcement and courts and judges in Virginia for a long, long time, the way we speed this work up, the way we really begin to make everyone safer in Virginia is when we come together in coalition to address homophobia, sexism, misogyny, racism, classism, and that we are really working as one to promote a safer Virginia and country for us all.
All right, so it looks like we got to that question, and I don't want it to be the final thing we end on either. So I just want to thank all of our panelists for being here today. If we could just give them a little virtual round of applause and claps for sharing their story, sharing their wisdom. Oh my God, so much wisdom and power in this room and in the chat too. People were sharing all sorts of information. I hope you will DM each other, share contact information so you can keep in touch. And I want to pass it back to Anti real quick just to finish us up.
Yeah, thanks so much, Talia, and thank y'all for sticking around. I know we're running just a little bit tight on time. Thank you so much to our panelists for being here with us. We will be following up with an email with all of the resources that our panelists dropped and ones that we have compiled, along with just the final deck of slides from today's presentation. We didn't get to go to the Mentimeter today. Unfortunately, we did figure it out, and it looks like today's someone's birthday. So I just wanted to shout that out and say happy birthday to whoever it is. Looks like B is saying thanks y'all for showing up. Do stick around, or we do look forward to y'all joining us next week. Next week, we'll be talking about the confirmatory adoption bill, now law. And so we look forward to y'all joining us. We are going to take one final picture. So if you're comfortable, do feel free to turn on your camera. If you're not, that's totally okay too. And we will say cheese in about 10 seconds. I'm seeing folks turn on their cameras. Awesome. Okay. Awesome. So go ahead and I'll count us down. 3, 2, 1. 3, 2, 1. Awesome. So I got those pictures, and thank you again